scientific errors in it. And I'm here to say that the Quran and the Hadith don't have any kind of scientific error.
Oh, yeah, so he said the Quran and the Hadith don't have any scientific errors. So he's really he's raising the bar there. Okay.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. I didn't realize he was saying that. I didn't know he said both. Okay. Here we go. Come on. Here we go.
So let's go with the first source he claims. It's al-Dhahabi, Volume 1, pages 218 and 220. Now,
so let's go with the first source he claims, al-Dhahabi, Volume 1, pages 218 to 220. Let's see what he says.
al-Dhahabi is not authentic. It's not an authentic source. If you go to...
al-Dhahabi is not authentic. It's not an authentic source.
al-Dhahabi, Volume 1, pages...
So that well, let me play the rest. I'm gonna have him play the rest of this.
Did I nail it? By the way, did I nail it?
Yeah, that's exactly what you said he was gonna say, which is what he said. Yeah, so that's the first one. He has some other responses, but let's see what he says about it. How much detail he adds.
170 to 171. Al-Dhahabi warns people that his books are filled with weak and authentic narrations. So
he says it's because al-Dhahabi warns people that his books are filled with incorrect accounts. That's what he said so far. Let's see if he adds.
Al-Dhahabi is definitely not a authentic source according to Muslim scholars.
And he says according to Muslim scholars, it's also not an authentic source. So he gave two reasons why he's saying al-Dhahabi is not an authentic source.
And again, if you read the beginning of al-Dhahabi's book, al-Dhahabi Volume 1. al-Dhahabi warns people that his books are filled with weak and authentic narrations, and this narration is not authentic. I looked into it.
He said, again, he repeated himself, al-Dhahabi warns people that it's filled with weak and inauthentic narrations, and he said, and this one is not an authentic narration. I looked into it. Let's see if he says anything else.
al-Dhahabi Volume 1, pages 218, 220. It's not authentic. The next verse he said.
Okay, so that's the answer for the first thing. David, I don't know if you want to have specifics in response.
No, I'm having trouble because since there's like a 30-second lag, I'm trying to listen to him, but I'm hearing you at the same time. So, but you are kind of reviewing the statement. So he's just denying al-Dhahabi. By the way, the reason al-Dhahabi says that is because he knows he includes all sorts of embarrassing stuff, like the Satanic Verses, which by that time Muslims are starting to try to deny because it's embarrassing. And in his own defense, hey guys, I'm just passing on this information. So if you don't like anything here, no problem. I'm just recording the story. But look, if he wants to deny al-Dhahabi on the giant fish or whale at the bottom of everything, no problem. We'll go Ibn Abbas, right? So Tafsir of Ibn Abbas, commenting on Surah 68 verse 1. Says, Allah swears by the Nun, which is the whale that carries the earths on its back while in water, and beneath which is the bull, and under the bull is the rock, and under the rock is the dust, and none knows what is under the dust save Allah. So you have multiple sources on this. You have the sources that are recorded in al-Dhahabi, in the history of al-Dhahabi, but you also have the Tafsir of Ibn Abbas, who's this is the granddaddy of all Quranic studies right here, and he's a companion of Muhammad. You have these teachings that go back to Muhammad's companions. You can trace them back, it's not wise, to Muhammad's companions, and they're total, utter nonsense. Now, what are we supposed to do? What are we supposed to do now? We're supposed to say, okay, just ignore all this stuff, and we'll pretend that later Muslims made all of this stuff up. And sorry, guys, you don't get to do that. If you want to throw out something that Tabari said when he's, I would say, certainly the greatest Muslim historian of the first few centuries, if you want to throw out what he said, and you want to throw it out even when it lines up perfectly with what Ibn Abbas said, if you want to just start throwing out what these guys said, guy, you have to throw out all of it, right? If you're saying we can't trust what this guy said because he's 2 centuries later and maybe he messed up, great, throw out all of your hadith, throw them all out. It's all garbage and nonsense according to you. Keep in mind what Ithisham is telling us now is that Muslims were making stories up about what Muhammad's companions were claiming, and that these were so widespread by the time you get to the time of people like Tabari that people like Tabari couldn't tell the difference between a true story and a false story. And well, if that's the case, then you're telling us that in those multiple generations leading up to Tabari, the Muslim community was filled with liars who were making up stories about the creation, about Muhammad, about the foundation of everything, about what these verses mean, and they were so effective that they could attribute them to people like Ibn Masud, who Muhammad said, if you want to learn the Quran from anyone, learn it from Ibn Masud. They're attributing it to him. Ibn Abbas. All of these guys, they have all of these false stories attributed to them. What does that mean? That means that the early generations of Muslims, not according to us, I believe that this stuff does go back to these guys, but according to people like Etisham, the early generations of Muslims were the biggest bunch of liars and fabricators the world has ever seen. Keep in mind, who's preserving the Quran during this time? The biggest bunch of liars the world has ever seen, according to Etisham. Who's passing on all these stories? The biggest bunch of liars the world has ever seen. Guys, when you start saying this, when you start saying even our great historians were a bunch of liars and fabricators, and they couldn't get to the truth because so many generations of Muslims were doing nothing but lie, and you don't see what you're actually doing to your religion here. You can't build a good foundation of knowledge about Muhammad on a foundation of 2 centuries of the biggest bunch of liars the world has ever seen. So that would be my my response right there.
Yeah, and a brief look at the internet about what other Muslims say about this collection. I want to draw everyone's attention to a website that's been on the screen. I just put on here while David was speaking, so you guys can see it. SunniConnect.com. One place for authentic Islamic downloads upon the methodology of the final prophet Muhammad. History at Tabari. Okay, look what it says here. I want to draw your attention to this, what is said about this. And by the way, this is a place where you can also get it. Okay, we're going to read this right here, okay? Collecting all 40 volumes of the history of al-Tabari, completed in 1999 by a distinguished group of Arabists and historians of Islam, the annotated translation of the history of al-Tabari is arguably the most celebrated chronicle produced in the Islamic lands on the history of the world in the early centuries of Islam. The 39-volume set, published in the SUNY series in Near Eastern Studies under the general editorship of Professor Ishan Yarshater of Columbia University, is the only complete English translation. The history was published by SUNY Press between 1985 and 1999, with the index added to the set in 2007. It is essential and highly praised in Islamic studies. So, that's just one place, but it just seems like maybe people aren't really agreeing with him. And
no, Vocab, that's what I said. Even in Tabari's time, right? He's including stories that were incredibly embarrassing to Muslims, right? I mean, these things would have been like shattering the faith of Muslims by that time, because by the time of Tabari, that's where they've already begun the process of historical revision, weeding out things, right? Because basically, let me give you an example. During about the first 2 centuries of Islam, they had a doctrine of, it's called Ismat al-Anbiya, right? The God's protection of the prophets. Right? But for those first 2 centuries, the doctrine of God's protection of the prophets meant that God is going to protect prophets from persisting in error, not from making an error, from persisting in the error, right? So a prophet could make an error, but God's going to bring him out of it later, right? So with that doctrine, that was perfectly consistent with the story of the Satanic Verses, where Muhammad promoted polytheism, he promoted shirk, he promoted idolatry with what are called the Satanic Verses. But then God sent Gabriel later on to tell them that he'd been tricked and fooled by Satan. And then Muhammad admitted that he'd fabricated verses and stuff, thus classifying him as a false prophet, according to Deuteronomy 18:20. But so notice, that's why for those first 2 centuries, you find all kinds of people reporting the historical incident of Muhammad delivering the Satanic Verses. After that time, the Islamic doctrine changed. The doctrine of God's protection of the prophets changed too. God's going to protect prophets from entering into any major error, right? God's not even going to allow it to happen. Well, if God's not going to allow it to happen, you obviously can't have Muhammad admittedly delivering revelations from Satan. And so then they have to weed those stories out, which is exactly what they did. So they start weeding these stories out because they were so embarrassing to Muslims. So that's what you find in Islamic history. You go to the early centuries and they have it's one big giant mess. And then you go later and they'll come up with some doctrine or some teaching, and then they have to start throwing out all of history. It's similar to, a more modern concept that the Quran has been perfectly preserved. You go to the early centuries of Islam, they have no idea what you're talking about. They're all talking about chapters coming up missing, large passages coming up missing, verses being eaten by a sheep. They're talking about all of these things. Suddenly, at some point, Muslims decide, nope, perfect preservation of the Quran, right down to the letter. And then what do they have to do? They have to throw out or explain away all of their sources saying that the Quran has been changed over and over and over again. So by the time you get to Tabari, they've already been doing the historical revision and throwing stories out. Tabari includes something like the Satanic. He includes the Satanic verses and so on. He knows that Muslims are going to be upset about this, and so as brilliant as he was in putting this together, and you got to be. Keep in mind, he basically wrote a history of the entire world from creation down to his time. And that's why it's 39 volumes. And what do Muslims say today? Nope, he's a liar, can't trust him, he's garbage, because the real reason is because he says all these things that we don't like, and our Muslim scholars have already thrown out by now. And so he said all these things, and so we can't trust him. So
all right,
Assalamu alaikum and all to my non-Muslim viewers. So we continue on to part 3 of 6 of the series where I talk about where I respond to Vocab, Malone, Anthony Rogers, and David Wood. So basically, David Wood says a lot of stuff about al-Dabari and things like that. Now I have al-Dabari's book right here. So I got al-Dabari Volume 1, which was cited in that Muhammad's Boom Boom Room episode. So all you have to do is just read what al-Dabari admits here. What al-Dabari admits on page 170 to 171, he basically says, and I'll just read the relevant portion here. He says, this book of mine may be found to contain some information mentioned by us on the authority of certain men of the past, which the reader may disapprove of and the listener may find detestable because he cannot find sound and no real meaning in it. In such cases, he should know that it is not our fault that such information comes to him, but the fault of someone who transmitted it to us. We have merely reported it as it was reported to us. So, this is al-Dabari Volume 1, page 170 to 171. So what David Wood draws out of this, or what he understands out of this, is that al-Dabari is passing down all these embarrassing things, the Satanic Verses, the Zainab story, yada yada yada. He's passing down all these embarrassing stories, and al-Dabari is saying, well, that's not my fault. I'm just throwing everything out. I'm just throwing it out there. If you don't like it, it's not my fault. It's the fault of the person who's transmitting it. So David Wood saying, well, that fits the criteria of embarrassment. So there are two things I want to address here. First is the issue of what al-Dabari says. On Volume 1, page 170 to 171, al-Dabari is basically saying, saying that it's not his fault that he's passing down these unflattering stories. It's the fault of the transmitter. In other words, al-Dabari is saying is that there's dishonest people during his time and before his time that would make up these stories, either intentionally or unintentionally, but most of the time intentionally. They would make up these stories, and al-Dabari would record these stories, whether the person was truthful, the person who was telling the story was truthful or dishonest. It didn't matter. Al-Dabari would just record that stuff. So we have to look at the isnad, or we have to look at the chain of transmission for those stories to determine whether those stories are true or not. So everything goes by the chain of transmission. everything other than the Quran, because we know the Quran, um, or the Quran says it's from God. Now, whether you believe it's from God or you believe it's from Muhammad, whatever. But that's a different topic for a different day. The Quran is the only Islamic book or the only Arab book that doesn't have any kind of chain of transmission, right? Because we know where the Quran came from. The Muslim belief is it came from God. The honest critics' belief is that it came from Muhammad. But even the critics admit that the Quran goes back to the Prophet Muhammad, right? There's even these these Orientalists, whatever, they admit that the Quran we have today is the same that was delivered by Muhammad. Now, whether you believe it came from God or not, that's a separate issue, or that's an issue that can be discussed another time. But I have quotes from various non-Muslim scholars like Fred Donner, etc., who say that the Quran came from that the Quran we have today is the same we have from Muhammad. So we don't need an isnad for the Quran, but we have isnads for basically every hadith, everything. It doesn't matter if it came from Ibn Ishaq, Bukhari, Muslim, Abu Dawud, Ibn Sa'd, whatever. Every source of Islam, whether it's talking about the Prophet, Abu Bakr, Umar al-Khattab, whatever, whoever it's talking about in the early Islamic period, every story has to be evaluated by the isnad or the chain of transmission, because not everybody was honest back in those days. So we have to weed out the false stories and the true stories by looking at who's transmitting those stories, whether they were honest or dishonest. So everything goes by the isnad. If I didn't clarify that in my first video, I'm clarifying it now. It has to go by the isnad. Or what al-Dhahabi says in the beginning of his book is that, look, it's not my fault that I'm relating these, not flattering stories or these stories that people find detestable. It's the fault of the transmitter. It's the fault of the chain of transmission. It's the fault of the isnad. It's not my fault. It's the fault of whoever the source of the stories were. Whether they were honest or dishonest is up to the reader to do their own research to see if the source of that story was honest and dishonest. Right, so not everything in al-Dhahabi is weak or inauthentic. I'm not saying that. Al-Dhahabi put the Prophet Muhammad's life in chronological order. Same thing with Ibn Ishaq. He put the life of the Prophet Muhammad in chronological order. The problem with Ibn Ishaq was that most of the time he gives no full chain of transmission. He gives no sources. So his sources could be authentic or they couldn't be authentic, or they were just or the sources were dishonest and stuff like that. So that was Ibn Ishaq's problem. This al-Dhahabi's issue was that he's not fact checking, right? He's not fact checking his sources. He's just repeating what the sources are saying. Whether al-Dhahabi's not vetting his sources. He's not doing a background check on whether whoever's telling him the stories were honest or dishonest. He's just saying, okay, you have a story you want me to write down? Okay, I'll write it down, without vetting the sources or without fact checking the sources. So that's a big problem. So that's why al-Dhahabi is generally not an authentic source, because he didn't do any kind of fact checking. So you always got to check the facts, right? You always got to see whether your source is relying authentic or honest information or dishonest information. It doesn't matter if the story is authentic. It doesn't matter if the story is flattering or not flattering. It doesn't matter if the story is embarrassing or good. You still got to fact check the story. So then David Wood brings up the criteria of embarrassment. The criteria of embarrassment doesn't work for Islam, and it doesn't work for Christianity either. Because of course people would make up these flattering stories and these not flattering stories at that time, at the times of early Christianity and at the times of early Islam. Now why would people make up these unflattering stories? It would be for political reasons or theological reasons or sectarian reasons or political reasons or various theological issues or theological reasons. So people would make up these stories um, for whatever reason, whether it's good stories or bad stories. They would make it up. So there's a really good book. I want people to read is this book, Studies in Hadith Methodology and Literature by Imam Azami. So he talks about how there were early Hadith books and stuff like that. So the Hadith, so they would say, well, the Hadith came 200 years later. Well, that's not true. There were very early Hadith books that were written by the disciples of the Prophet Muhammad, like Ibn Abbas, Ali, things like that. So people like the disciples of the Prophet Muhammad wrote down Hadith, and it was passed on by generation to generation, until it reached people like al-Dhahabi and Bukhari and stuff like that. So so basically in this book, I wanna talk about what he says about intentional fabrication of Hadith. So basically, there were people who would make up these stories, and why they would make up these stories would be to support their sectarian attitude, or either in law or in theology or in politics, or due to their prejudice of race or country or certain people, or those who fabricated for their personal interests. So why people would make up these embarrassing or these unflattering stories was for to support sectarian attitudes, or politics, or their own prejudice for race or country, or for personal interest. So basically, this person, Imam Azami, tells why people would make up these stories about Prophet Muhammad, or his disciples or the companions or stuff like that. So there were people who would make up. Of course, there were people who would fabricate stories for the sake of rulers, or for the sake of politics, or for the sake of sectarian reasons or theological reasons, or whatever. And this is chapter 8, entitled "Fabrication of Hadith Causes and Means of Elimination." So I would just recommend this book. Studies in Hadith methodology and literature, that where this person gives reasons why people would make up these not flattering stories at that time, for a reason, whatever that reason may be. So the criteria of embarrassment does not work here. It doesn't work for Christianity, and it doesn't work for Islam. Then he brings up Tafsir ibn Abbas. He says, well, if you don't want al-Tabari, then fine, we can throw that out. What about Tafsir ibn Abbas? Tafsir ibn Abbas, narrates the story about the whale and the bull, and how the whale carries the earth on its back, and things like that. Well, I looked into that. I looked into that Tafsir, and that Tafsir isn't authentic anyways. There's no evidence that it fully goes back to Ibn Abbas, so it's not authentic. It's not an authentic source. So not only that, but the narrations that talk about the whale and things like that, as Ibn Kathir states in his book al-Nihaya, al-Bidaya, Nihaya, Volume 1, page 15. These stories come from Israelite. Israelite is stories passed on by Jews, and then Muslims recorded it. Now, why Muslims recorded from Jews, I don't know. Maybe they were just writing down anything they heard or something. I don't know, without fact checking their sources. So those narrations that talk about the whale and the whale carrying the earth and stuff like that are either weak or fabricated. Sheikh al-Bani in his book Siyata al-Hadith al-Daif, Hadith number 1253 and 6309, talk about those sources about the whale being weak and fabricated. Al-Dhahabi in his book Sirah al-Nayam al-Nuba, Volume 4, page 61, and Volume 10, page 669, talk about the weak or the fabricated sources of the whale and things like that, or the fabrication of Tafsir ibn Abbas and things like that, and Ibn Raghail, Ibn Rajab, Volume 3, page 138, also talks about how that story about the whale carrying the earth on its back is weak and fabricated, and how Tafsir ibn Abbas isn't a authentic narration. So we can't. So even Tafsir ibn Abbas isn't reliable. Then he talks about Hadith methodology of the first two generations of Muslim literature. Then I would say we have to read how the Hadith came into being, and again I would recommend this book, Studies in Hadith Methodology and Literature by Imam Azami, where he talks about like the first two generations, like the first generation being the disciples of the Prophet Muhammad, and the second generation being the disciples of the Prophet Muhammad, how they had a methodology of weeding out authentic and inauthentic stories about the Prophet Muhammad. And so everything has to go by the isnad. And back then there were people who were liars, who were dishonest. There were Muslims who were dishonest and who would fabricate. Not only Muslims, but there were Jews and pagans and stuff like that who were dishonest and would make up stories about the Prophet Muhammad and make up stories about the early Muslims, for reasons, as his book explains in chapter 8, Fabrication of Hadith Causes a Means of Elimination, Intentional Fabrication of Hadith, where he talks about how Muslims and, these pagans and Jews and whatever would make up these stories, for political reasons, sectarian reasons, theological reasons, etc. So they would make up these not flattering stories or these embarrassing stories for their own personal reasons or whatever. So again, I would recommend this book, Studies in Hadith Methodology and Literature, to see how the Muslims first invented, or the Muslims preserved the saying, stories, and actions of the Prophet Muhammad in the first three generations, and how they would weed out true stories true stories and false stories by the isnads, or by fact checking their sources being the chains of transmissions, or the isnads. So this is a really good book to get if you want to learn about how the Hadith methodology came to be, and how the early Muslims, the disciples of the Prophet Muhammad and the disciples of the Prophet Muhammad, went through what they had to go through to not only preserve the Hadith, but to weed out the true stories from the false stories. So again, I would just recommend Anthony Rogers, David Wood, and Vocab Malone to buy this book and to do their own independent research, or any kind of non-Muslim watching this video. So then in the next thing David brings up is the Satanic Verses. Where he talks about God's protection of the prophets, where God would allow the prophet to make a mistake, and then later on he would fix that mistake, so the prophet wouldn't repeat that mistake again and stuff like that. Well, even early Muslim scholars said that the Satanic Verses is not authentic. So even early Muslims were admitting that they were collecting inauthentic reports. They were collecting these inauthentic reports, whether they were embarrassing or flattering of the Prophet Muhammad. So basically, even before al-Dhahabi, Ibn Ishaq wrote his book, before al-Dhahabi wrote his book, and even Ibn Ishaq admitted that the Satanic Verses story is weak, or is a fabrication. So check out this quote. Abu Hayyan al-Andulasi, who died in 745 after Hijrah, mentions about this story. Imam Muhammad bin Ishaq, who's Ibn Ishaq, the compiler of sirah, was asked, he said this is from the fabrication of the heretics, and he wrote a book on the issue. This is found in al-Bahr al-Muhit Field Tafsir, volume 7, page 526, and I'll post the quotation below. So even Ibn Ishaq believed that the Satanic Verses story is inauthentic, or it's a fabrication. So even early Muslim scholars like Ibn Ishaq were basically saying that they were collecting these. Even Ibn Ishaq, even these early Muslim scholars like Ibn Ishaq were saying that they were collecting they were basically admitting that they were collecting these false stories. And Ibn Ishaq even admitted that the Satanic Verses is a false story. And he was the earliest person who narrated the Satanic Verses, according to the critics of Islam, the Orientalists, the Christian critics, the atheist critics, etc., etc. So even their own source refutes them, because even Ibn Ishaq admits that the story of the Satanic Verses is a fabrication from the heretics. The heretics meaning the pagans, or the Jews, or whatever, or the early critics of Islam. So even Ibn Ishaq admits that that story is a fabrication from the enemies, or the critics of Islam, the early critics of Islam. So even the early Muslims basically admitted that they were collecting weak stories and putting it into their collection. So even that doesn't work here. So even the early Muslim scholars admitted to incorporating these fabricated stories into their collection. So again, just to summarize, the criteria of embarrassment doesn't work here, because of course people would make up these good stories and these not flattering stories for a reason. Then he brings up, Tafsir Ibn Abbas about the whale and the bull and stuff like that. Well, Tafsir Ibn Abbas, first of all, it's not authentic. Second of all, I cited several Muslim scholars who said that story of the whale and carrying the earth on the back and things like that is a fabricated story. It's a fabricated story. It's not authentic, and we know where that story came from. According to Ibn Kathir, it came from Israel. Israel means Jews, so it came from these Arab Jews. And these Arab Jews passed on this bizarre story, and the early Muslims, just desperate to write down whatever they were hearing, desperate to write down like anything, regardless of fact checking whether it's true or not, wrote down that story. So the early Muslims just recorded whatever they were hearing without fact checking it. And then he brings up Hadith methodology. Again, he hasn't studied Hadith methodology because there were the early Muslims, the disciples of the Prophet Muhammad, the disciples of the disciples of the Prophet Muhammad, the disciples of the disciples of the disciples of the Prophet Muhammad had a methodology of weeding out true stories from false stories, using the chain of transmission, determining the sources, whether those individual sources were honest people or dishonest people, and most of the time they were actually dishonest people. That's why Bukhari only collected 7,000 hadith, or only included 7,000 hadith in his collection, despite the fact that he weeded through, at least 100,000 hadith. He's only picked out 7,000 to be authentic. So this man did his fact checking really well, unlike people like Ibn Ishaq and al-Dhahabi and things like that. So that's all I wanted to say about that issue. Then David Wood brings up Quranic preservation. He brings up, even early Muslims thought that the Quran wasn't preserved and things like that. Well, the Quran was actually preserved during the Prophet Muhammad's lifetime. We read a hadith narrated by Abdullah ibn Umar, where he said Allah's messenger forbade the people to travel to a hostile country carrying the copies of the Quran. And this is found in Sahih Bukhari, book 52, Hadith number 233. So what that means is that that during the Prophet Muhammad's lifetime, the Quran was the Quran was a complete copy. It was a complete written copy. So you know, even Sahih Bukhari, which is the most authentic source of information, which collected the very earliest writings from the disciples of the Prophet Muhammad, even Sahih al-Bukhari has narrations where the Prophet Muhammad, where, you know, the early Muslims, which would be the disciples of the Prophet Muhammad, had a copy of the Quran, a complete copy of the Quran. So even that doesn't work here. But Quranic preservation is a separate topic where that's a big discussion. But even if you read Sahih Bukhari and Sahih Muslim and things like that, you know, even if you read the Hadith collections, like for example in Mustadrak, al-Hakim, Hadith number 6051, you know, there's Hadith where that Hadith says that the Quran was available during the Prophet Muhammad's time. So people had written copies, or the disciples of the Prophet Muhammad who learned from the Prophet Muhammad, who learned the Quran from the Prophet Muhammad, had physical copies with them. So that right there tells you that the Quran was preserved, or the written Quran. The Quran was written during the Prophet Muhammad's time, and there were physical copies of the complete Quran during the disciples, during the life, not only during the disciples' life of the Prophet Muhammad, not only during the disciples' life, but during the Prophet Muhammad's life, there were complete Qurans going around, according to authentic Hadith literature. So the Quran was preserved. So if you read authentic Islamic literature like Sahih Bukhari, al-Hakim, the Mustadrak al-Hakim and stuff like that, there are hadiths saying that the Quran was complete. You know, so that refutes the idea that, so that refutes his claim that the Quran wasn't preserved during the Prophet Muhammad's time. But that's a different topic for a different day. So this is, you know, this is just my response. This is just my brief response to what he was saying about al-Tabari and things like that. So stay tuned. Part 4 is coming up soon. You know, so hopefully, you know, this refutes what he's saying about al-Tabari and about hadith sources and about Tafsir Ibn Abbas and about Quran preservation. You know, so this is just my 2 cents about what he said. But stay tuned. More videos are coming up next.